Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom and welcome to today's video where I'm going to be showing you how to create a progress bar using web components. Alright, so this right here is going to be the finished result. We've got this progress bar here and we're able to make this progress bar render and work by simply using a custom element right here called progress-bar. And we're also able to give it a value, a percentage, using the percent attribute here of, for example, 65. If I was to update this value here to be something like 20% and press enter, as we can see, the progress bar is going to update with an animation or transition to that new percentage, all right? So this right here is really nice to work with when it comes to web components. And if you're not too sure how to create a web component, this right here is a simple example with, I think, enough information and enough, behavior for you to understand and hopefully expand on it and create some more web components. All right, now the source code for this is going to be linked down below if you would like to download and follow along, so you can of course do that. And now we can head inside this tab right here. We're going to begin from an empty index.html to of course create what I just showed you. Alright, so hopping into VS Code here, the first step is going to be to create a new JavaScript file which is going to hold the code for the custom element or the progress bar. Alright, so we can create a new file here called progressbar.js, and now we can simply include this file at the end of the body. Right down here we'll say script source going to of course progressbar.js. So now we have our JavaScript file linked up. We can head inside here and begin work on the web component. All right, so the first step here is going to be to define a new class. So we're going to say class progress bar is going to extend HTML element. Okay, so this right here is crucial to ensuring that we're going to be able to get a custom element. So as part of that also, we're going to now define a constructor inside here. Now the constructor is going to also call the super method, which means basically it's going to go up and call the constructor for the HTML element, and this is also key to making this work. All right, so once you've got this right here, this is kind of like the bare minimum when it comes to a class for a web component. All right, so dropping down here, we can now register a custom element, so we can essentially use that progress-bar tag in the HTML. So in order to achieve that, I'm going to hop down here and we're going to simply say here custom elements.define. Now we're going to be passing through here the string to use as the tag name. So going to pass in here progress-bar. It's also important to remember that when it comes to defining these custom elements, you must have a dash within the name. Okay, cool. A second argument here is now going to simply be a reference to that progress bar class, which we defined right up here. So now, essentially, we can begin using this progress bar tag in the HTML. So going back inside here, we can now head up inside the body and we can say a new progress-bar element just like that. Now, we're going to also take this opportunity to pass in a percent value. So we can define a new property on this progress bar to be percent equal to 65 just as a starting value. Okay, so of course you're able to easily change that with either setting the attribute or you can set the progress bar dot percent equals. Those are your two methods there, but as an initial value here of 65, this also is going to be a custom property. So you can name this whatever you want. Okay, it's basically user defined. All right, so we have this right here, and if I go back in the browser here, do a refresh, we can see we get nothing on the page, but more importantly, there are no errors in the JavaScript console, which means so far everything is going okay. All right, so going back inside the JavaScript file right up here, we can now work on the shadow DOM. Okay, so for those of you unfamiliar with the shadow DOM, basically it's like a DOM which belongs to your custom element. Okay, so this is sort of protected, which means if, for example, you have a paragraph tag that exists inside your shadow DOM for your custom element, then you have some other normal external CSS style sheet on your page. if that style sheet contains some styling, like a background color change or color change, whatever it might be, if there's styling applied to a paragraph tag on the page, those styles are not going to come through and target your paragraph inside the shadow DOM, even if the CSS selector matches what's inside there. So it's sort of protected, which means you have full control over the CSS, which applies to your elements inside your custom element. Okay, now you can do things to essentially allow some properties or some values to be passed in to, of course, customize it for certain themes and things like that. I'm going to be showing you how to do that later on when it comes to the actual fill color of the progress bar. But for now, we can begin work on that shadow DOM. So heading up inside the constructor, we can create a new shadow DOM by saying this.attach shadow, then passing through here an object containing a property. Now, this property is going to be called mode, and we're going to set this to be open. So now we have a shadow DOM. We can now begin work on it and add some things to our custom element. So dropping down here, we can, for example, create a new paragraph tag. We can say const p equal to document.create element. As per normal, when it comes to creating elements in JavaScript, we can pass in here a new p tag. We can say p.textContent equal to sample paragraph as an example. And we can also just say now this.shadowroot.append child, and now pass through here the paragraph tag. So this right here looks very familiar if you've ever created elements in JavaScript before, but this time we're appending to the shadow root as opposed to document.body or whatever it might be. So I can save this, go back in the browser, refresh, and as we can see, we get this right here. If I inspect our progress bar here, we can see we have the shadow root and of course the paragraph belonging to that. Just to demonstrate my point earlier about the CSS style sheets, if I go in the index.html here, if I make a new style tag and target all paragraphs on the page, I'll make the color to be blue. I can save this, go back in the browser, refresh, and it does not get affected by that, CSS style, even though, of course, it matches with the p tag. So we're going to be seeing, of course, how to style our elements inside here very shortly. But for now, let's go back inside the JavaScript file and, of course, create the actual elements required for the progress bar. So heading right up here, we can remove these two things and we can now say const style equal to document.create element. Once again, passing through this time a style tag. So we're going to need to create a CSS or just a set of styles for our custom element, and also a constant called fill equal to a new div. So the fill refers to the green part that I showed you in my example. So that's going to be adjusted in terms of its width depending on the percent value that we're going to be passing in. Okay, so we have the style and we have the fill. So now I want to apply a class to the fill. So I'm going to say here fill.classList.add, going to add the class of fill to that div. All right. We can also say here this.shadowroot.append. So using the append method, it's going to let us append multiple things at once. So I can pass in the style as well as the fill. I can save this, go back in the browser, refresh here, and we can see now, of course, we have both the style tag and the div as part of our progress bar custom element or component. Okay, going back inside here now, let's actually apply some CSS. Okay, so for this, we can define a static property right up here as part of the progress bar class. So we'll say here static CSS equal to a new JavaScript template string using the backticks near the 1 on your keyboard. We can now use multi-line strings here. So we can now just simply specify some CSS styles. Now, if I go back inside the elements section here, essentially you have the main container. So when it comes to styling up this one, this is going to be called, or this can be styled up using this in CSS, :host. So :host refers to essentially your main container, the progress bar. Okay, So we're going to first begin by setting a display of block. I'm going to say also a width of 250px on this and a height of 40 pixels. We can also apply a background here of a light gray triple E, just like that, as well as a border dash radius here of 4 pixels alongside an overflow of hidden to ensure that our border radius is going to be maintained even if our fill takes up more space. Okay, we can save this here. All right, then we can drop down and we can say style.innerHTML is equal to, and then simply grab onto that static property. So we'll say here progress bar dot CSS, just like that. So I've just made it a property just so it's a little bit neater on top of the whole class here, but you can of course just copy this string here and put it down here. That's perfectly fine as well. But like I said, make it a bit neater in one place. Save this, go back in the browser, refresh here, and we have this. So we've successfully applied some CSS styles just to the class of fill, of course, sorry, the progress bar, the whole host as part of the progress bar. Okay, cool. So now let's apply some styles to the fill. So we'll say fill here, and we can firstly set a width of, let's just do 50%, just so we can see our progress, right? And a height of 100% here. And a background of 009578, that is the decode green color, alongside a transition of width at 0.25 seconds. So basically, when we adjust the width or the percent value, it's going to be a nice transition on that width, which takes 1/4 of a second. We can save this, go back in the browser, refresh, and we get something like this. So once again, more progress towards, of course, our fill and our progress bar. Okay, cool. So now, this is where things get interesting because we've done the CSS and we've got our elements inside the shadow DOM. The next part is actually getting this thing to be functional, all right? So when it comes to this here, we're gonna need to essentially define a few getters and setters. So I'm talking about the percent property or attribute right here. So what I do wanna do is I wanna go down here, right? I want to say a new script tag in the HTML. I want to say const my progress bar equal to document.query selector, then pass in here progress dash bar. So basically, if I console.log the progress bar constant here, save this, go back in the browser, refresh, go in the console, we get, of course, a reference to our progress bar. Now, if I go down here, right, I want to say my progress bar dot percent. Okay, if I save this, go back in the browser, refresh, undefined. Okay, so clearly there is no link currently between this attribute and this property. So let's make a getter for percent. Back inside here, remember, this progress bar is an instance of this essentially. So let's say get, then say percent. Okay, this method is going to run when I access the percent property. Whatever I return is going to be the value, which is 4%. I can return here, for example, 45. Save this, refresh in the browser, 45 right there when calling my progress bar dot percent. We get 45, right? So let's say when I call this method, when I try and access the property, I want to simply get the value of the attribute. Okay, back inside here, we can say return this, because this refers to the element itself. So we can simply call get attribute and get the percent attribute on that element. Okay, I can return that. Back in the browser, refresh, and we get 65 when calling my progress bar dot percent. Now, if I pass in like DOM, a string, not a number, refresh, we get DOM. So let's prevent that. Let's also prevent numbers more than 100. So basically less than, we need between 0 and 100. So let's prevent that. So going back inside here, we can now simply move the get attribute into a constant. So we're going to say const value equal to this.get attribute once again, passing in percent. So now we have the value constant. It's going to be a little easier to work with. So I'm going to do the first check for a string, or anything that's not a number. So we'll say here if the value is not a number, then we can simply just return a value of 0. So if I pass in something like a string of text, for example, my name, Dom, save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get 0 right there. So that's working. We can now also say something like this. We're going to say, look, okay, fine, the value is a number. So now we're going to say if the value is less than 0, then we're going to simply just return 0. If the value is more than 100, then we're going to more than or equal to 100. Then we are going to say, oh, my mistake, sorry, more than 100. So between 0 and 100 inclusive. In this case, we'll just return 100. Okay. In all other cases, we can simply return the value, but we're going to be wrapping it inside the number function right here, just because it's going to convert our string into a number. Because of course, when you have HTML attributes like this, even though it's like, for example, a 20 or, it's a number, right? But it's actually a string, as the data type. So going to convert it to a number using the number function right here, and we're good to go. So if I pass in something like 20 back in the browser, refresh, we get 20, perfectly fine. If I pass in like 110, we're going to get 100. And the last check here for negative numbers, so -10, and we should get 0, and we do right there. So that's working perfectly fine. So as we can see, we've defined a sort of like custom property, a getter, on the progress bar here to simply hook onto the attribute and get us that value. So it's going to work in the exact same way when it comes to setting that property. Okay. Now, right down here, we're now going to say, look, okay, we're going to say set %, just like that. So when you try and say, progress bar dot % equals something, you're trying to set that % property, we're going to be able to receive the new value just like that. Okay. Now, very straightforward. We're going to say this dot set attribute. We're going to set the % attribute to be the value, just like that. Okay. So basically, whatever you pass in here or whatever you set it to can now be reflected when you then try and get that value. So I can say something like, my progress bar dot % equal to 80. Now, of course, by default, this % is equal to 65. So if I try and change it to be 80 now, back in the browser, refresh, go in the elements section, we can see we now get 80 right there. So we're able to essentially convert our property change into an attribute change. And this right here is a good system because we're sort of relying on the attribute to give us that %. So it means we don't need to store the actual % as a normal property on this class. It's all done using the HTML attribute. Makes it a little bit cleaner. Okay. Now the last part here is going to be really straightforward actually. So we're going to say this. So going up on the top here, we're now going to say static. Okay. So static get observed attributes. Okay, so this right here is sort of like it's like a special method or static function here or static method, which just details which attributes are able to be observed for when they change. So custom elements allows us to react to when certain attributes changed. Sort of changed, and we can, of course, react to that. So I'm going to say here, return %. Okay, so now that's one part of the puzzle. So we're saying, look, let's observe when the user changes the % attribute. The user I'm referring to is the developer like yourself. So when that % attribute changes, we're going to want to update that fill on that width and change the progress bar size. Okay. So hopping right down here, we can now say this, all right? We're going to say attribute changed fallback. So this method right here is going to accept three properties or three arguments. Okay, it's going to be name, old value, and new value. But we only care about the name parameter. Okay, so let me just console log what this does. So I'll say log name, going to stop here, go back in the browser, refresh, Then we're going to simply change the percent property to be something like 70. Hit enter. Back in the console, we now get nothing. Let's figure out why. My mistake, guys, I actually wrote fallback and not callback. So let's make that a C for callback and try again. So back in the browser, refresh, and we get 2 logs here. So this method was called twice. Okay, now this method is also called a lifecycle method. So there are many of these, or there's a couple of these on custom elements. This one here is probably one of the most important ones. So look, this method was called twice, as we can see. The first time was when the page first loaded up. So if I go back inside here, we can see we have obviously set the percent initially. So that's one call of that method. The second call was when we did percent equals 80, because remember, this is going to set that attribute, which is going to, of course, trigger this method. So we can now say, look, okay, if the name is equal to percent. So if we're changing the percent attribute here, we can now just say this.shadowRoot dot query selector. We can grab onto the class of fill, which we created earlier, right up here in the constructor. Okay, we can say dot style dot width is equal to, and then simply pass in here using template strings. We can say the value, then percent. So we can say here, this dot percent. Remember, this dot percent is going to call this method and give us a valid number between 0 and 100, depending on what's provided in the percent attribute. So if I save this, refresh, we get 70. Okay, go inside here, make this 30. Press enter, and it goes to 30. So our functionality is there, okay, and it was that simple. So we're simply relying on the attribute, like I mentioned earlier, to give us that percent. And when the attribute changes, we're going to simply update the width of that fill, which exists inside the shadow DOM. So now the last step here is going to be customizing the actual fill to provide our own custom color. So inside the fill here, there's actually quite a few techniques when it comes to, customizing the CSS of your, custom elements and shadow DOM. Technique here is really simple. So for the background of the fill, we're going to use a CSS variable. So we're going to say var here, then just say, let's just do fill-color as our variable name, okay? Have a fallback here, or actually double dash. Have a fallback here of, just do like maybe like a dark gray, so 222, just like that. So if I can't find this property, then let's go to dark gray. Save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get this right here. That dark gray is being set. It's also probably going to be a good idea for you to set that width to now be 0% for an initial load. And also now we can define this variable back inside the index HTML. So let's also remove this percent assignment, just so we're starting fresh, okay? Go inside the style here, and we're going to be targeting the progress bar just like this as normal in CSS, but this time we're going to say -- fill color and assign this to be, let's just do red. So now it's going to take this fill color, which is being assigned on the parent progress bar, and it's going to pass it down to the child here of the fill, and of course grab it here for the background. Save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get red for that color. So you guys can go ahead, you can create many different variables here for your width, your height, your background here, whatever it might be. And of course you can customize your theme and make the progress bar look nice in your own website. So that's how to create a progress bar using web components. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.